Hello again. When I was still a Jehovah's Witness, I picked up this little book. Nice little book. The Impregnable Rock of Holy Scripture. Published this edition in 1896. I was particularly struck not just by its title. I was still going to Jehovah's Witness meetings at this point. I wasn't used to finding books that defended the authority of Scripture, but when I saw who the author was, I was astounded, because it was no less than William Gladstone, one of the most famous prime ministers of Great Britain. At the end of his life, in his 80s, he had published this book, The Impregnable Rock of Holy Scripture. What I didn't know about Gladstone at the time, I did know that he'd been Prime Minister of England 4 times, and that perhaps was the most famous Prime Minister of Britain during the Victorian era. I didn't know his politics. I didn't know the way his life had been transformed by his own education, self-education mostly, during his political life. And I didn't know that he was a staunch defender of the faith at the end of his life. What I did know about him was that he had had the status of being, if you like, the great liberal of the Victorian era, that he was not very well liked by Queen Victoria herself, nor by Benjamin Disraeli, who was perhaps the second most famous Prime Minister, the Conservative or Tory Prime Minister, during the same years that Gladstone was the liberal leader that was most often reverenced and despised for many of the policies he advocated, both on the local, that is the British Empire level, and as foreign policy for Great Britain overseas. For instance, he advocated in his later life the Home Rule for Ireland, and that was greatly unpopular, and his party was voted down on every movement they made in that direction. But his influence has been long-lasting. He is a true definer of what liberalism should mean, so that when we talk of conservatism today, such as Margaret Thatcher's conservative government in the 1980s in Great Britain, she is an heir, as it were, of the British liberal tradition, at least as she saw it, and that would be Gladstone. Now, Gladstone in his early life, when he came to Parliament at the age of 23 in 1832, was a Tory. That was the old word for conservative, and he was not someone who would have high reputation today because of his Tory leanings. In those years, it meant, for instance, opposing at the end of slavery. He was voted in. One of the reasons he was that the Tory party needed staunch opposition to fend off the influence of William Wilberforce and his cohorts in trying to bring an end not just to the slave trade, which they'd already done about 2.5 decades before that, but now slavery itself. And sure enough, in 1833, slavery was outlawed in the British Empire, despite the best efforts of the Tory party. And Gladstone was a Tory, but as his life proceeded, he became transformed, and by the end of his life, in 1898, he was the great liberal of Great Britain's politics. And by the time he wrote this, his influence, he'd already been Prime Minister 3 times, and his influence was at its greatest. Gladstone takes on in this book the great revolution that was happening in Great Britain and across the Western world in thought about Scripture. That's why he titled his book The Impregnable Rock of Holy Scripture. He was liberal in politics and in character, but he was staunchly conservative in his view of Scripture. While no believer in the infallibility of Scripture, because he was also a great classical scholar, specialized in Homer and Greek history before 700 BC, he was able to make comparisons that few others in that age of specialization were able to make. That is, between the institutions of Greece and the institutions of the Old Testament, which coexisted during the centuries of the great Homeric epics in Greece. In his book, early on, he talks about the influence of specialization. And he says this: Moreover, I have there had the opportunity of perceiving how among specialists, as with other men, there may be fashions of the time and school which Lord Bacon called idols of the marketplace, and currents of prejudice below the surface, such as to detract somewhat from the authority which each inquirer might justly claim in his own field, from their title to impose their conclusions upon mankind. So, by our standards of English prose, that's rather tortuous, but Gladstone is in effect saying that even in the 1890s, specialization was taking its toll, and men were no longer able to see the depth and breadth of history or the fields beyond their own specialization. He goes on to say there is such a thing as mistaking the indifferent for the essential, and as a slavish adherence to traditions insufficiently examined. But the liabilities of human nature to error do not all lie on one side. It may, on the contrary, be stated with some confidence that when error in a certain direction, after a long precedence, is effectively called to account, it is generally apt, and in some cases certain, to be followed by a reign of prejudices or biased judgments, more or less extended and in a contrary direction, what we would call a radical pendulum swing. There is such a thing as warping of the mind in favor of disintegration. So here, this is 125 years ago, Gladstone was writing this and talking about the swing that was already very visible in Victorian England from conservatism to a radicalism, with which even a liberal like Gladstone was distinctly uncomfortable. He says, often does a critic bring to the book he examines the conclusion which he believes that he has drawn from it, often when he has not thus imported it, yet the first view, in remote perspective, of the proposition to which he leans will induce him to rush at the most formidable fences that lie straight ahead of him, instead of taking his chances of arriving at it by the common road of reason. And often, even when he has attained his conclusion without prejudice, he will, after adopting, defend it against objectors, not with argument only, but with all the pride and pain of wounded self-love. So Gladstone is anticipating the discoveries of modern psychology, that we don't always think objectively, that even scholars are capable of just wrong-headedness, and even worse, the arrogance of self-love. Later in the book, he talks about the comparison between Moses and Lycurgus, the great lawgiver of Sparta. And Lycurgus, he notes, has much less authority that is based upon objective history and the credibility of the usual historical sources. Lycurgus has much less credibility in history than Moses did, but in Gladstone's day, and still today, Moses and the authority of the Pentateuch are continually being attacked by those of like prejudices that he's just talked about, people who have lost their objectivity in a rush to jump from the conclusion of the absolute authority of Scripture over to a position what we could just define as extreme doubt, as exemplified by those we call the new atheists. Now he talks about the existence of Moses in the context of the normal criteria of historical documentation this way. He says, the existence of Moses is even better and far better established than that, for example, of Lycurgus, the Spartan lawgiver. We know Lycurgus is in the main from the one great fact of his very peculiar institutions. They, such as we find them in historic times, compel us to presume his existence in a prehistoric time. Not only their high and elaborate organization, but their practical efficacy in separating and fencing off from the rest of Greece the Spartan community reduces to something near absurdity any such supposition as that they were essentially no more than a late growth reached by imperceptible degrees. We know Moses as well from his institutions, which are by no means less peculiar, and which, as experience has shown, have been very far more durable than those of Lycurgus. In the case of Moses, as it happens, that we have much evidence independent of and anterior to, that is before, the institutions themselves in their historic form. Yet no one doubts either the existence of the Spartan lawgiver, Lycurgus, or the general character of his personal work. If the form of the books in which the Mosaic legislation reaches us be open to the suspicion of manipulation by scribes or editors, or if it suggests some suspicion of developments, how does this compare with the case of Lycurgus? About or from him we have no books at all, and yet it would be deemed irrational to doubt either the existence of the man or the substance of the work performed by him. So as a historian, specifically of Greek institutions, Gladstone was in a position of authority to be able to make such a comparison between the way we look at Greek history and the way we look at Hebrew history, that is the Old Testament. And he saw a vast difference in approach. What would undermine Moses, in Gladstone's view, would undermine all history. And that is no doubt the case. So when you see Gladstone make this attack upon the higher criticism of his day, he's not doing it from an inerrantist position nor from what we would call a view of Bible infallibility. He's just looking at the historical data. He's not therefore speaking with prejudice about this because he has no stake in the conservative positions that many of us adhere to. But as a historian, looking at the data objectively, he reached the conclusion that indeed the credibility of Scripture was unassailed, and that indeed Christianity was based upon the impregnable rock of the Old Testament.